I don't know how people in biblical times expected their religious leaders to arrive. It's not clear to me what sorts of expectations this widow in Zarephath had for the prophet from Israel. But in our time, more often than not, we expect authentic religious people to come offering their help, to come with food to feed the hungry, with healing to help the afflicted, with answers to help the grieving. We expect our religious leaders to come supplied. The church built an entire theology of mission around just such expectations. Religious people bring the food, the medicines, and the supplies. Religious people build the hospitals, the churches, and the schools. Religious people bring the knowledge about sacred things, the wisdom about how to be human, the experience to know how God expects us to be in the world. The church built an entire theology of mission around just such expectations. And it is not a bad way for the church to live out its faith. It is a theology that grows right out of the gospel. Feed the hungry, clothe the naked, welcome the stranger. But sometimes I wonder if just such a theology cultivates a kind of church that only feels purpose when it's got something concrete to give. I wonder if it cultivates a kind of people that only expect to experience faith when they have something material to offer. Elijah, the religious leader, the prophet, has nothing concrete to give. No food, no water, no money, nothing. In fact, he's hungry. He's in need of food himself. Elijah, the great prophet, has nothing to give but a good word from God. Most of us, I dare say, hate to be in that situation. Shame is what people in our culture are made to feel when we have nothing to give. Shame is what people often feel in the church when they haven't got much in the way of concrete things to offer. Even though Jesus makes it clear that Christ comes to us hungry and outcast and thirsty and naked, even though Jesus makes it clear that Christ comes to us poor and hurting, looking for a people to receive him, shame is what most people most often feel when they don't have much in the way to give. Shame or fear and the anxiety that comes with it. Shame is what we're made to feel because our culture teaches that we have earned our station in life. We buy into the myth that everything that we are, everything that we have, are things that we have worked for. They're ours. It's as if we cannot accept that our own prosperity has as much to do with the nation we happen to be born into, or the family we happen to be born into, or the part of town we happen to be born into, or the racial categories that we happen to be born into. To feel dependent on anyone as an adult in this culture feels like an affront. Even though none of us has ever had anything in the way of success completely on our own. Which is probably why most of us spend more energy than we may even be conscious of to make sure that we do not find ourselves in need. To make sure that we can handle any situation on our own. And when we can't handle something on our own, we feel like a failure. Or we feel the fear of being at the mercy of another. That's the way I felt last week when I was on vacation, when my friend and I got stranded on an island somewhere in the Caribbean. It was supposed to be a day trip by ferry. I had rented a car from an actual person, like they literally rented their personal car to me for the day. And we arrived well in advance of the 5:30 ferry back to the mainland, except there was no 5:30 ferry, even though I had a ticket with 5:30 printed on it. So with the sun low on the horizon, we found ourselves with no food or water or place to stay on a very large pair of islands with less than 2,000 inhabitants. Now, I realize that getting stuck on an island in the Caribbean is far from running out of food in your hometown during a famine, but the fact that we felt so much anxiety over this non-life-threatening situation just shows you how far removed are people like me from the stressors of being vulnerable in material ways. There was no office to speak with, no official number to call. We were on our own and had no choice but to throw ourselves on the mercy of total strangers. First, on the mercy of the owner of the car who told us, "Sure, keep it for the night. I'm not going to need it. At least we'd have shelter." I walked down to the water and found some fishermen packing up for the night who told us to drive 15 minutes to Big Joe's bar and find the owner. Maybe Big Joe could supply us with one of his rooms. So we found Big Joe, whose stature matched his name, drinking with his buddies on a Sunday night. Big Joe sympathized with our predicament, but shared that no, he no longer had places to stay as coronavirus had ended all of his side businesses but this one. And putting his very large hand on my very small shoulder, Big Joe promised us with the biggest laugh I've heard in a while that if worse came to worse, we could sleep in his doghouse, whatever that meant. But he said we'd probably be more comfortable at Denise's place. So we drove another 10 minutes searching for someone named Denise, who we found at a hotel enjoying the cool dusk air on a deck overlooking the beach with two of her employees. Denise told us she was so sorry, but they were not officially open until the next day. But after seeing our faces fall, she said, "But I'm sure we can accommodate you for the night." Now, we only experienced maybe 2 hours of fear and anxiety, but I didn't like any minute of the fear, even though without it, I would have never met Big Joe or heard his story. I would have never found Denise's place and later learned that it was one of the few island hotels owned by locals in her family for a couple of generations. Being in material need, at the mercy of the kindness of others, is what opened a door that would have not been open in any other way. And yet, still, I would do my best to avoid that feeling. Which makes it difficult for someone like me to know true faith, reliance on another, while surrounded with everything that I need. It's why, paradoxically, so many of us experience a deeper faith precisely when we are vulnerable or in danger, when it's clear we cannot get to a better place on our own. It's why alcoholics and people who are homeless, cancer survivors, and people who have lost a home often find that faith comes easier. They know they need help, and needing help isn't shameful, it is human. It is what opens us to each other. That's what happens to Elijah and this widow. Elijah meets the widow in Sidon outside the boundaries of Israel. Elijah and the widow are different in almost every imaginable way, different in gender, nationality, in faith, in vocation. And yet those differences seem to fade in the midst of their shared hunger, their shared vulnerability, their shared need. Elijah has learned to trust in God's provision through thick and thin, to give thanks to God in plenty and lean on God in want. Perhaps the church, like a prophet that gets too accustomed to always being on the giving end of things, needs to learn how to trust when we don't have what we need to meet the need, when we don't have the right resources, the right answers, or the right words of comfort. Perhaps this needy place is where faith is cultivated, strengthened, and renewed. The place where we learn to accept just how reliant we are on God and on each other. The widow doesn't need that lesson. In a patriarchal culture, to be a widow is to be detached from the economic security that a husband or a father brings. And this insecurity has reached a crisis. And yet, even here, this widow seems to trust, taking her last bit of food and sharing it with Elijah. Maybe when there is nothing much to lose, sharing comes easier. You all know the miracle that occurs. You heard it. The jar of meal lasts until the famine is over. The food is multiplied. But this is not the first miracle of the story. The first miracle is that someone would choose to share the last bit of what she has with a stranger, someone she has just met, a person who is different from her in every way, different in gender and nationality and faith and vocation. This is the overlooked miracle that always leads to the greater ones. It takes someone willing to share a little bit of what they have, a little bit of meal and oil, or perhaps 5 loaves and 2 fish to make a miracle. And our tradition argues that it is much easier to share when you see yourself in another's need rather than above it. I think we all know that shopping season is just about to begin for what has become known as the pre-Christmas season. Once again, our airways will bombard us with messages trying to convince us that Christmas is mostly about giving things, hoping to teach us that Christmas miracles are the ones we control, we create, we purchase out of our excess. Meanwhile, God may be trying again to surprise us by coming to greet us. If history has any bearing, God will come to us not as a powerful prophet with lots of stuff to give, not as a religious leader flaunting all the right answers, but as a child or perhaps a guest, dignifying shared dependence, inviting us to learn what we really crave, how to share our food and drink, how to share our fears, how to share our hopes and dreams, how to share our lives. It is notable to me that what we practice each week in the liturgy, listening and speaking, responding and being sent, and today feasting, are basic human things. The feast that we share together at this table isn't really a feast at all. It's a little morsel of bread, a little taste of juice. But the focus is on the actions, not the things. The action of sharing bread that most of us did not make. The action of sharing drink that none of us produced. The action of gathering around a table where the only host is the one who is also no stranger to being a guest. It is the table of mutual vulnerability where to get a seat, all one needs to do is arrive with empty hands. This is what God's realm looks like. A realm so foreign to our contemporary experience that we have to practice it together in order to contemplate its reality. It is a realm that reflects the reality of our humanity, our creatureliness, dependent on the earth and its bounty for our daily sustenance, the air we breathe, the food we eat, the water we drink. A table where we are invited to participate in this first overlooked miracle, sharing not out of our excess, but in the midst of our vulnerability. This is the overlooked miracle that always leads to greater ones.